Welcome to the world of Reach. The Road to War. Part 1. (2347) Common Era / Interstellar Calendar. Reach System, Planet Reach, Southern Hemisphere, Karen Corporation Mining Facility 12. Lihu Li Zhang watched the bird arrive with a hand shading his dark brown eyes. The moons reflected Reach's sun in the early pre-dawn hours, making the sky an orange. It was still a couple hours before the blue hue of dawn would grow, then fade to the usual pale yellow of daylight. Li felt the weight of the decisions coming in those hours. If the worst came to pass, he hoped he had the strength to make the right call. The ship from South Reach City had spiked into low orbit and was hammering back down on a pillar of fire. He shrugged his shoulders inside the ridiculous black suit jacket Karen corporate regs required all department heads and executives to wear, and watched the unusual arrival descend from the heavens. There was nothing usual about today, Li thought, fighting down panic again. This was no cargo ship, and this was not a typical rough dropship landing. This was a Karen Corp passenger craft. The big burners at the bottom of the rocket flared out long before landing, replaced by 4 jet-assisted rotors, landing the glossy black craft with a feather's touch, right at the end of the landing grid closest to the gantry into the mine. "She's a Zang," growled Li's boss and Facility 12's chief administrator, Louis Hellman. "You look like a miner." He held up a slate to Li's face, letting the built-in camera show Li the smear of dirt down his left cheek. Li rubbed his cheek with the arm of his suit jacket. "Sorry, sir." Hellman shook his head in disgust, then started towards the ship. "Let's go." Forgetting Li and fidgeting nervously with the curved plastic tubes of his nasal cannula, then tugging on the fanny pack he carried his oxygen pack inside. Li followed behind. Li barely noticed his own cannula. Like virtually all the colonists natively born on Reach 581, the third planet in the solar system, wearing air tubes outside was second nature. Louis Hellman was an Earther on a 5-year tour with Karen Corp. His ruddy complexion had only gotten ruddier in the 3 months since he'd arrived. The mine administrator was embarrassed about the purple splotches on his hands and the tips of his ears, even though medical had cleared him to remain on duty, all of which made his standing order banning face gear from admin-level meetings all the more curious. He'd even docked Li's pay for leaving his cannula draped around his poorly knotted tie while delivering his weekly departmental report up in the administration office. Li hid his contempt for the imported corporate stooge as they walked onto the landing and takeoff tarmac to meet Karen's VP of Resource Management for the entire planet of Reach. It was a beautiful day topside. Li usually welcomed every chance to get out of the mine and enjoy the crystal-clear vistas offered by the site's isolated location amidst rolling hills and by the thin atmosphere which made the nasal cannulas a necessity for anyone leaving a pressurized structure. The view offered no calming respite today. Ahead, the shining, impeccably maintained luxury craft's rotors were already retracting, and aerodynamically shaped panels locked above them to ease the nose cone's journey back up through what atmosphere Reach had. Administrator Hellman waited at the bottom of a ramp being lowered to the tarmac. He turned and grimaced for Li to hurry his ass up and fall in line behind him as they waited for the mighty VP to disembark. Li obliged him and hurried up, but he knew he had minutes left before anyone from Karen head office would step out of the craft. Head orifice was full of suits like Louis, imported from Earth to manage wealth most native Reachers would never touch in a lifetime of work. The purply cyanotic skin splotches were common on Earthers, among the other symptoms of poor adaptation to Reach's low barometric pressure and atmospheric oxygen content. There was a joke kids liked to tell about that, contrasting the splotches with the exploding dye packs company stores mounted to food. Nobody stole more. Nobody was more greedy than Earthers, so when they came to steal from Reach, the planet gave them the marks to prove it. Lee was used to seeing greed marks on his co-workers. 2 years into his first 5-year tour as chief engineer, technically an executive position, and the highest he'd ever heard a Reacher of attaining. Lee didn't know any Reacher who'd been elevated to administrator level by Karen, or any of the dozens of other corps who kept the colony functioning at a profit, or who'd owned stock in said corps. He didn't even know anyone beside his corporate overlords who'd ever left the planet. He took the time waiting to stare back out at the rolling mountains. Thanks to the low barometric pressure, tea boiled at lower temps faster, bread baked hotter and faster, and the views of the rolling hills that covered most of Reach were always staggeringly beautiful and ultra-high-def clear. He turned his head again and tried for a moment to calm from the unchanging landscape. He thought of Maggie, how she would be staring out at almost the same view from their farm on the outskirts of Sixth Landing. Reach was full of big views, wide open spaces, and thin air that was eagerly gulping all of the chlorofluorocarbons the terraforming plants could churn out to thicken and heat the planet. No matter how much a hurry Earth was in to pillage Reach, it was a big planet, with a long way to go before the impact would be felt. But Earth Corps like Karen aimed to take all they could from Reach, and they were just getting started. "We all know you love your details, Zhang," Lewis muttered out of the corner of his mouth as the door in the side of the craft finally unbuttoned with a hiss. "But if VP Tawan asks a question, just stick to the bullet points. Keep it short, yes?" "Yes, sir," Lee responded, swallowing the distaste he felt for his self-aggrandizing corporate climber of a boss. Lee needed this job he hated, this job that made him wear a suit jacket over his mine work suit, that earned him the scorn of the miners he'd come up with, that took him away from his farm and his family. His smarts and hard work had earned him a scholarship to an engineering degree. The degree had gotten him out of the mines, and a supervising position in Karen's mining division. Lee's brother and his wife still worked their fingers to the bone just to hold on to the farm all three shared as stakeholders, but he couldn't go back to the farm anytime soon. Farmers barely held on, and he didn't want that for the children he and Maggie wanted to bring into this world. So Lee had paid off his original contract to Karen, but he stayed on. Well into his third 5-year contract now, and finally the end was in sight. By the end of this tour, they'd own the farm free and clear, and he could become a full-time farmer, not the flunky of a corporate climber who wasn't nearly as concerned about what was happening at the bottom of his mine as he was about securing his path to promotion. "Stick with the bullet points," Hellman said. As if this was just another day at the mine, another small detail of engineering Lee was pestering Hellman with, and not lives on the line. Hellman reached back and batted Lee's shoulder as VP Dewan finally started down the ramp. The short, balding man's large eyes were almost bulging out of his face, and Lee very nearly laughed out loud. The man had sent 2 suit-and-tie-wearing assistants and 2 uniformed Karen Corp security officers out ahead of him, like canaries in a coal mine, to see if the air really was breathable, before dragging his own posterior out into Reach's thin air. His hands pressed frantically to the thin plastic tubes beneath his nose and poked them farther up his nostrils. Lee felt his lip curl in disgust at what passed as a corporate overlord. He oddly wondered if Administrator Hellman would insist Dewal remove the cannulas he wore once inside the facility, but shook his head. Unlikely, given that would probably amount to career suicide. "Let's go," VP Dawal said, his voice muffled by the hand he held over his mouth. He rushed past Hellman and Lee, hell-bent on getting an airlock between himself and the atmosphere of Reach. The vice president's entourage had to hold each of his arms as he stumbled once, then twice on the way to the mine. Lee and Administrator Hellman watched on as Dewan took more heaving breaths, his nostrils pinching shut around the air tubes with every intake of breath. Yes, Reach's atmosphere was thin, Lee thought to himself, but this was ridiculous. Usable oxygen content was low, even after 200-plus years of terraforming, first by machines and then by the colonists who arrived later on, but any healthy person could walk a few dozen steps without a cannula, and any of this sort of drama. They had to stop again, halfway up the ramp from the landing tarmac to the facility's main passenger airlock, for Dewan to get what looked to Lee like a panic attack under control. The pressure was over 600 millibars, for Pete's sakes. There were humans on Earth that lived in half of that. Of course, places like Everest or high-altitude Tibetan communities still had slightly more available oxygen than Reach, Lee admitted. Even so, TUC without physical strain was 10 to 15 minutes for healthy adults, but Lee sometimes wondered whether TUC, or time of useful consciousness, applied at all to corporate executives. Finally, the group made it inside the surface structure. Lee watched incredulously as the main vehicle doors to the facility ground down and sealed shut along with the small group airlocks. Mercifully, they didn't try to overpressurize the work area with breathable mix. Apparently, the placebo effect of closing the doors was enough to calm Dawal. As soon as the doors came down, the man straightened and sighed with relief. "Honestly, how anyone survives on this rock," he muttered, adopting a regal walking pattern and heading for the elevator without need of an elbow to clutch. "Welcome to Facility 12, Mr. Vice President," Administrator Hellman began as the elevator doors hushed shut behind the group, in a voice full of admiration and gushingly fake respect. Dawal waved him silent. "Skip the speech, Administrator." He paused, leaning towards the man on his right, who whispered Lewis's last name. "Hellman," Dawal repeated. "I don't plan to be here long enough for the tour, just long enough to authorize a solution to your ugly little mess." "Yes, of course, sir." Administrator Hellman wasn't destined to make it much farther up the corporate ladder, Lee guessed, by the trouble he was having synthesizing a realistic, ass-kissing demeanor for the VP. "The mine is divided into two 14-and-a-half-hour shifts, matching up with Reach's 29-hour day. Yesterday's day shift was the first run under the new quota guidelines that just came down, and they had unexpected difficulties." Hellman's voice petered out. An uncomfortable silence stretched. Hellman seemed unable to say the words to VP Dawal's face. "We got everyone out, but the night shift went on strike near the start of their shift," Lee finally answered for the man. "They shut topside out of systems control, effectively barricading themselves at the bottom of the mine shaft until their grievances are heard." Dawal's comically big eyes and drooping red-rimmed lids expressed disbelief as they swung from Lee to the administrator's face. Dawal's entourage studied handheld screens, studiously avoiding an outburst Lee could predict was brewing inside their boss. "This is my chief engineer, Liu Zhang," Hellman said, running the words together in a low, breathy voice. He hadn't quite finished the introduction when Dawal exploded. "The platinum group metals and rare earth elements your men are mining today were guaranteed to our clients months ago." He whipped a finger into Administrator Hellman's face. "You gave them a job, and now they threaten job action? Fire them! Fire the entire crew, and know that this delay will be reflected in your annual review." "We can't fire them," Lee said, his anger and frustration overwhelming his sense of place. "And you can't easily replace them, even if you don't meet their demands." Lee's stomach danced in his belly, and the elevator jerked to a stop, and the doors opened onto the operations level of Facility 12. The scent of lemon balm and curry plants rushed in, carried by a warm breeze. VP Dawal stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on Lee's. The rest of the group waited on Dawal. "Why can't I fire them? What are these demands?" Lee's eyes returned to Hellman's, and the man answered for him. "Return to the original per-miner shift load." Dawal snorted, his big eyes growing larger. "You mean a complete reversal of the quota increase we just ratified with EarthGov, don't you?" He swept past Hellman, out into the rock-hewn expanse beyond. "Not an option." Lee stared at Dawal, not believing his ears. Yes, Karen Corp was all about business. Yes, they were tough negotiators and hard on their employees. Yes, they'd recently signed an unprecedented, Some would say impossible new quota for delivery to Earth. None of that mattered in the face of the reality that was unfolding in the mine. "They're making it an option," Lee shouted after the VP, his helplessness bubbling to the surface. The entourage followed DeWall out into the brightly lit cavern. Hellman went next, glaring back at Lee. Lee cared even less about what the man thought with every passing moment. He'd hoped a VP arriving on site would cool things down a notch. Even businessmen should understand a concrete reality like the one he was about to show DeWall, but somehow Lee couldn't shake the feeling. Things had just taken a frightening turn for the worse. Operations level was a massive space, carved into Reach's crust a kilometer beneath the surface, and the surface elevators opened onto its best feature. Once, this space had been filled by a massive vein of copper rich in noble metal components. That had been cleared out generations ago, and in its place, Karen Corp had built housing, R&D, and administrative facilities, and more. In the center of the facility, the elevators opened onto the green, a massive clearing retrofitted as an underground park for its off-duty staff, as well as providing rotating food crops to feed its personnel. Solar-equivalent lighting panels covered the roof, covered in gauzy layers that tricked Lee's mind into seeing clouds instead of wafers of plastic. The illusion was wasted on Lee at the moment due to the dozens of stretchers that covered the grass, each containing a groaning, screaming miner. The day shift. "That replacement team you have trained and ready to go," Lee growled at DeWall as he surveyed the scene. "They're spoken for. All of them." "The day shift reported unexpected stratification in the vein," Hellman explained. He waved in Lee's direction. "Chief Engineer Zhang advised a work stop, but as it was the first shift of the new quota, I assumed he was posturing on behalf of the miners. He's colony-born," the man whispered towards DeWall. "And," Hellman hastened to add it, "I had a risk analysis done that backed my call." Lee bristled, hearing the administrator finally admit he had ignored his warning because Lee was colony-born, and therefore lazy or somehow twisting his findings to make things easier for the miners, who, Hellman gauged, equally lazy. Nothing could be further from the truth. The exploding quotas Karen's head orifice kept demanding made sure there was no room for laziness in the mines. Money mattered more than miners, and everyone in the room knew it. Hell, everyone on Reach knew it. "There are pockets of gas sandwiched inside unexpected stratification," Lee said, louder now. "Some of it exploded, bringing a chain reaction of shrapnel down through the entirety of Tunnel 1. We lost 2 miners, and most of the day shift will be out for weeks or months recovery time. There goes your trained backup team." Lee stepped forward, meeting DeWall's eyes. "Mr. Vice President, this new quota cannot be met. In fact, the last quota was not sustainable. It's why we missed the gas pockets that caused this explosion. We can't meet the new quotas without risking more lives." DeWall scowled at Lee and walked over to the closest stretcher, staring down at a miner with blood-soaked bandages covering her right shoulder. Her eyes were dull from whatever the medtechs had given the woman for her pain. "Get me a line to the miners," DeWall said, reaching his hand back. "The quotas can't change. You will all just have to adapt your mining practices. We can talk about danger pay, I suppose." "Danger pay?" Lee asked, incredulous. He took a step forward to say more, but Heller warned him back, with angry eyes and raised palms. Heller held a slate out to DeWall. The man made no move to grab it, just stared at it and began to speak. "This is Vice President Yuli DeWall. Who am I speaking to?" The other end came to life with a crackle of interference. Someone was coughing in the background. "This is Carmen Morales, Shift 2 Crew Chief. We've been looking forward to talking to you, Vice Pres—" "I don't care. I don't care what you thought you were doing, stopping production. I don't care why you think I'd be sympathetic to your demands. I don't care what you say about anything until you tell me you're restoring remote access to the mines and doing your God's damned job. Then, maybe, we can keep this off your permanent record." DeWall waved his hands around. "And perhaps even can talk about danger pay to motivate you to meet your new quota." Are you kidding me, Mr. Vice President? Have you seen all the stretchers on the green? My guys have been charting the gas pockets down here, and let me tell you, you picked the wrong time to up the quotas. Talk to Chief Engineer Zhang. He'll tell you. We can't even meet the old quotas without fragging more of my people, so you can stuff your danger pay up your nose. I can't spend it if I'm dead. VP DeWaal screwed his palms into the sockets of his large eyes. Very well, he sighed. Let me see what can be done from here to everyone's mutual satisfaction. DeWaal made a slicing motion at his neck, and Hellman cut the line. This doesn't sound promising. Let's talk about contingency plans. The vice president wove his way between the stretchers down the green toward the operations center. His people, Hellman and Lee, followed in his wake. Lee stopped at the bottom of the slight hill while everyone else funneled into the operations center. He turned and stared. The green was a mass of white stretchers. It was a miracle they'd only lost 2 lives so far. Contingency plans, DeWaal had said. More were going to die now, Lee was sure of it. VP DeWaal would have some trick up his sleeve to staff the mines. Maybe a scramjet was already on its way from another facility with a mining crew ready to be sacrificed to Facility 12's new quota. He couldn't let that happen. Could he? Taking a stand would cost him his life, his children's lives, for untold generations. Lee scratched at the dirt on his face, ashamed at his thoughts. He half expected purple spots were growing on his face as he turned his back on the field of stretchers and followed DeWaal inside. You have been listening to Reach, The Road to War. Written and narrated by John Miro. Music, All This by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Hear more of the story at ServingWorlds.com. Thank you for listening.